Today on CityCast Nashville, we're joined by Paige Flaker, criminal justice reporter for WPLN News. In collaboration with ProPublica, Paige recently investigated the early warning signs leading up to the Antioch High School shooting. Why were they missed, and how did Tennessee's lax gun laws contribute to the tragedy? Paige also shares with us how her reporting in rural Scott County could lead to real change. And just a heads up, y'all, this episode does discuss gun violence and DV, so please take care when listening. It's Wednesday, February 12th. I'm your host, Marie Cecil Anderson, and this is what Nashville's talking about. Paige, you recently published an article with WPLN in collaboration with ProPublica about the Antioch school shooter and his history of violent behavior. What did you discover in your reporting?
Aaliyah Swaby is my co-reporter from ProPublica, and she and I, for the last year or so, have been looking into Tennessee's threats of mass violence law, which is a law that severely punishes kids for making threats at school. We've been reporting a lot about kids who are getting arrested and charged with felonies, who are making jokes. We reported about one kid who just had a stuffed bunny in his backpack and had said he had an intellectual disability. And he said at school, like, my backpack's going to blow up if you touch it. And it was just the stuffed animal inside. So we've been reporting about that side of this law. And then when the Antioch school shooting happened, we were interested in looking at what had happened in the background with this kid who ended up committing the shooting. What kind of maybe red flags had there been? And how does that fit into the broader picture of how Tennessee looks at threats in school? And one of the things that we found that was brand new information was that when he lived in Clarksville before he moved to Nashville, he had actually been arrested because his mom had called the police on him because he had punched her in the face and had threatened to hit her with a chair. And so that information is particularly interesting to me as someone who has a history of reporting on domestic violence, because we know that domestic violence can be a really big red flag and a really big warning sign that someone might commit a shooting. We also talked to the student, the girl who in October of last year, Solomon Henderson, had pulled a knife on her at school and called her the N-word. And she had reported that to law enforcement and to school administrators, but he was back in school after just a couple of days. And so we were really examining, who knew what and when, what were the missed opportunities to help and intervene and get this kid help before something like what happened ended up happening.
Yeah, and you said in this recent article, you reported that even an Antioch teacher told WSMV that he was a walking red flag.
Yeah.
Do you feel anyone is taking accountability for what took place?
I think it's a tricky question. I think we know what these systems can look like when they're working at their best. There's been some really interesting, books written about threat assessments. There are best practices about threat assessments in schools and how it's supposed to be like an interdisciplinary team of different people like law enforcement and teachers and school psychologists. They're all supposed to come together, and when a student gets on their radar, they're supposed to do several things to try and help that student. So an example that we included in our story is like, if a kid is getting bullied and he's in the A lunch hour, move him to the B lunch hour where he wouldn't be interacting with his bullies. There's actually a lot of power that school officials have, that threat assessment teams, that law enforcement have to make sure that that student kind of gets redirected and put on the right path. And so that was a question that we really had in this reporting, was like, was there more that could have been done? And I think at the end of the day, it's very hard to know who knew what with cases like these because of juvenile confidentiality laws. So it's difficult to know whether it's the schools, whether it was the police, whether it was a combination of everybody. But those were some of the things that we've been looking into and reporting about.
Yeah, I was going to ask if the Metro Police responded to your findings.
Yeah, we had a conversation with them. I think it's difficult because if you take a step back and you look at it from the police perspective, the police are tasked with there being a crime. They get all the information that they need about that specific crime, and that's kind of what their role is. And so with a case like, kid pulls a knife on another kid at school, you have the victim and the testimony of the victim, and you talk to the kid, maybe you talk to like other witnesses in the cafeteria, but it's not like there would be a lot of sufficient evidence for the law enforcement officials to like go and request like previous interactions with other law enforcement in another jurisdiction. I think it's tricky. The dangerous thing with reporting on something like this is it's very easy to look at the red flags and connect all the dots in the aftermath. It's a different and more difficult task to look at all of these incidents and connect the dots before something happens.
After mass shootings take place, there is a rise of people demanding change. We saw that after Covenant, after Waffle House, 0 gun control bills were passed. We did see punitive gun laws pass around the same time. Can you tell us about some of those?
Right after the Covenant school shooting, our news director, Tony Gonzalez, and I reported a story that was kind of a timeline looking back at the last decade of the moves that Tennessee has made surrounding guns and gun laws. And yeah, what we found is this pattern that time and time again, there's a tragedy, there are people calling for changes in the wake of that tragedy, and then the Tennessee Republican supermajority does not address guns. This sort of dates all the way back to the Sandy Hook school shooting, which was kind of this inflection point where a lot of things changed for other states, where gun manufacturers started leaving more democratic states that were passing laws to address guns and to try and prevent school shootings. And Tennessee, instead of kind of being part of that movement, Tennessee was like, come on down, come to the South, and invited and courted gun manufacturers to move here to the state. That was sort of the beginning of this just year after year after year, Tennessee has just become more and more of a Second Amendment-friendly state. And that makes it really difficult, especially in the wake of these mass shootings. There were a lot of questions about how a 17-year-old got a gun. And MMPD even said that they had gone to Solomon Henderson's family's house previously, and they had removed 2 guns from the home that they said belonged to adults in the house. And in his diary, he actually wrote that his house had been raided and police took his gun that belonged to him, but that his dad took the fall for it. But it's very difficult to trace that gun. So there were questions like, where did the gun come from? And they run the gun through the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms e-trace system, which is a system that's only available to law enforcement. And because Tennessee has things like permitless carry, private sales that don't require background checks, it's nearly impossible to track a gun and to know where it came from. You have a bunch of guns that are stolen because of a 2013 law that allowed guns to be in people's cars. And so there's just sort of this unraveling over the years where it has made it very difficult to find accountability with, where did a kid get a gun to commit a school shooting? Because the most recent sale that they could find was years ago, but it has changed hands multiple times since then.
Wow.
It's rough because I remember even right before Covenant happened, I had covered a march where Moms Demand Action were at the Capitol. And one thing that talking to advocates for gun reform, they always say is we can't wait until something happens to make change. We have to prevent it. We have to want to prevent it. And a couple weeks later, Covenant happened. And so it is, there is a pattern here where gun laws keep getting looser and looser, and it becomes easier for more people to have guns here.
Is anyone anywhere doing anything that works to prevent school shootings, to your knowledge?
There are really effective threat assessment teams functioning well in the United States. They do exist. There's a lot of research about how threat assessments should work. It's just a matter of getting all of the players on board to participate in it. And I think where you run into an issue in Tennessee is that the best practice for a kid, a troubled kid who's showing a lot of red flags, the best practice, according to research, is to kind of flood that kid with resources, right? To connect him with a teacher that maybe he connects well with, to make sure that they have a little bit more like quality time together. Having a trusted adult has been shown to help in the school environment, making sure a kid is getting counseling, connecting with the parents, making sure that the parents don't have a firearm that's easily accessible in the home. There are things that can be done. Unfortunately, in Tennessee, at the Capitol especially, there is a drive to punish children. There's a drive to punish kids who are acting out and to arrest them, charge them with felonies, involve them in the criminal justice system. And research has shown that overall negatively impacts their long-term outcomes. So these kids are getting involved in the justice system young and end up in the justice system for the rest of their lives. Oftentimes, that's the school to prison pipeline. And so you do have this tension where there is a lot of research that just shows that like incarcerating kids, scaring kids by arresting them, handcuffing them, taking them to juvenile detention is not best practice for trying to get a kid to be on the right path and to have healthy boundaries and communications. And so you have a state that is very determined to punish children when that's maybe not what has been shown as the best practice for making sure that you're actually preventing a school shooting from happening.
Let's talk quickly about your work in Scott County, Tennessee. You've been following a story in this rural county near the Appalachian foothills and how they've handled domestic violence cases.
Yeah, so for the past 2 years, basically now, I've been looking a lot into the gun dispossession process for domestic violence cases. So what that means is here in Tennessee, when someone is charged with a domestic violence crime or is subject to an order of protection, they're supposed to give up their guns. That's what the statute says. But we have found that time and again, because of the way that people are ordered to give up their guns in Tennessee, there's just very little enforcement mechanism written into the law. You have this situation where people can say, yeah, I'm giving up my guns to a third party like a friend or a relative, and I'm dispossessing to that third party, but you never have to identify who that third party is. People can say that they're giving up their guns, but never actually give up their guns. And what we found in examining domestic violence homicides across the state, but here in Nashville in particular, we found that nearly 40% of domestic violence gun homicides were committed by someone who was barred from having a gun. Often the victims are women and children. We've been trying to illustrate some of the consequences of Tennessee's dispossession process, and that is how I heard about Scott County, where I was sort of always asking people, like, is anywhere doing this well in the state? Like, are there any success stories? And everywhere pointed to this kind of little rural, kind of sprawling county that's like deeply ruby red. They've gone for Trump by a wider margin than basically any other county in the state. And so it's a really fascinating place where they have just done a lot of work to address domestic violence. They have a domestic violence specific court program. And when I was looking into it, I found out that they had actually altered this state form, the firearms dispossession affidavit, so that third party had to be named, they had to give the address where the guns were going to be, and that third party actually had to sign a piece of paper saying, yep, I've got the guns. And oftentimes the judge there is even having conversations with that third party and being like, I need to make sure you understand why it's so important that you make sure that this person does not get their guns back. Like, here is what is at stake. And this change is a change that anyone in the state of Tennessee could have made to the state form, but they just haven't. And we found that Tennessee it's one of the only states that allows that third-party gun dispossession, and it's one of the only states that doesn't require that third party to ever be identified. And so what Scott County is doing is really revolutionary in comparison to what the rest of the state is doing. And recently, some legislation was introduced to try and change the statewide form so that it matches Scott County's.
What is the likelihood that this bill will get passed?
I wish that I had a crystal ball and could answer that accurately.
Right.
The answer is that you really never know in Tennessee. The legislation was introduced by two Republican lawmakers, Senator Becky Massey, who is an East Tennessee Republican, and then you have Representative Carrie Kiesling, who represents Scott County. So, I mean, two Republicans bringing legislation like this is a great sign. Both of them have been at the Capitol for more than a decade, but when I talked to Senator Massey about it, she told me that the kiss of death to a bill is to say that it would be easy. So I think that is just kind of recognizes that it's really hard to say in Tennessee what's going to make it through and what won't. But, altering a state form is a relatively simple step. It's a step that a lot of domestic violence victims advocates have been pushing for a really long time. Third-party dispossession has been something that has been very top of mind since the Antioch Waffle House shooting, because Travis Reinking, the shooter in that case, had been ordered to dispossess in Illinois, and he gave his guns to his dad, but his dad gave the guns back. And since then, people have been trying to change Tennessee's third-party dispossession law and the way that happens. But this is kind of the first piece of legislation introduced by two Republicans that I've seen in a few years now.
What do you think makes this different to them, to the Republicans?
I think Scott County being a very conservative place is something that works in favor of a bill like this, because Scott County, like I said, very Second Amendment friendly, lots of people own guns, and the judge in Scott County was telling me that she hasn't really run into any problems where people were refusing to sign the affidavit, where they refused to turn it back in, where they refused to identify who they were giving their guns to. So they've had good luck with compliance in Scott County, which really bodes well, I think, for its application to a wider swath of Tennessee. It truly is, at the end of the day, just ensuring that the law is being followed, right? The law already says these people who have committed a crime should not have access to firearms. It's in recognition of the fact that we know domestic violence situations are way more likely to become lethal if there is a gun involved. Separating those people from their guns, even temporarily, because an order of protection is a temporary measure, is a really great way to, research has shown, to de-escalate the conflict, to make sure that victims are safe. And so in a lot of ways, for responsible gun owners, a bill like this is just ensuring that responsible gun owners will not be impacted by a law like this one. It's only people who are breaking the law, who are abusing a loved one, a family member, their partner, their child, who will be barred as a consequence of those actions. So it's ensuring that the law, as is written, is being followed. It's not stripping someone of additional rights.
In your opinion, just as someone who lives here and sees the impact that mass violence continues to have in our community, what common sense gun laws do you wish Tennessee would pass?
Boy, I mean, that's tricky. I think one of the first things I noticed when I first moved here was the constant onslaught of press releases that we get from the police department about guns stolen from cars and about road rage shootings. And I've actually done a lot of reporting about how oftentimes those guns that are getting stolen from cars because people haven't locked them up properly, those guns are being stolen by kids who are selling guns on the street. Again, like that's how you lose the paper trail of where a gun came from. And I really think that the 2013 Guns and Trunks law, we have just seen the impact that that has had. We are constantly rising when it comes to road rage murders committed with guns. The FBI has looked at guns stolen from cars and found that, like, of the top 20 cities that's a problem. I think 4 of them are in Tennessee. I do think, and there have been a lot of pushes to introduce safe storage laws, so to make sure that people are required to be locking their guns up in their cars. I mean, availability of guns on the street, there's a lot of connection between that and the Guns and Trunks law. There really are consequences of the laws that have gotten passed in Tennessee. And I think if the goal is to have a safer state, which I think is something we can all really get behind, I would hope that that's not a partisan thing to say, then I think taking a look at the impact that some of those laws have had on crime would be a really important step to take. And I think my hope and dream is just to keep identifying places like Scott County that are doing work to try and address problems in their community. I'm really inspired by that type of reporting where it's like these people are faced with a problem and they're really coming together in order to try and address it. And how can some of those solutions potentially be scaled up? And so as far as my opinion goes, I want to keep finding stories like that and telling stories like that in hopes that people read them and consider them as like roadmaps potentially for ways forward in our state.
Paige, thank you so much for coming on. You are an expert in this, and we really appreciate all your work that you do, and we hope to continue this conversation with you throughout this year.
Thank you for having me. Some say expert, others say just a massive nerd. So it depends.
That's all for today here on CityCast Nashville, and please be sure to check the show notes for links to Paige's articles. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell your friends, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our Hey Nashville newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Doodles!